Folks, you looking at a guy that can handle pressure. I got a teenage son. You have got a teenage son, you can handle anything. I mean, when he was this tall, he wanted to ride to school in the patrol car. Turn the siren on, Daddy. But now he wants me to let him out about 2 blocks away so he can slip in. He don't want anybody to know his daddy's a state trooper. I mean, he came in the other night so loving and kind. He said, Daddy, what? Talk to him. Come here. I walked in and he said, you love me? I said, you know I love you. What's wrong? Do you really love me? I said, wait a minute. What have you done? He said, nothing, Daddy. Don't mess this up. I said, you just like your mama. You're never nice to me unless you want something. What have you done? He said, you're gone a lot, Daddy. I just wanted you to know. I just wanted to know in my heart you love me. He reached out and he put his arm and he locked him. He said, Daddy, do you really love me? I mean, now he got my heart. I looked at him, I said, son, you know Daddy loves you. I'll love you forever. He said, I'm glad I wrecked your pickup. I said, you wrecked my pickup. You see? He said, well, what happened to the love? I said, that's before you wrecked my pickup. I'm shooting you even as I speak. But any of you ever had your children come in and run you crazy? Have you ever had them break your heart? You ever had them, fellas? Have you ever wished that they were this little again? Have you ever wished, ladies, that you could just take them back and sort of like the movie I Shrunk the Kids, put them little bitty again and hold them? Hey, folks, let me talk to you a minute about that. Let me talk to you about the greatest heartache that you'll ever know. Oh, when my wife came in and told me that we was going to have a little baby, gang, I was making $49 a week at a picture frame factory. I looked at her and I said, we can't afford a baby. She said, well, now's a fine time to tell me. But you see, I wasn't afraid of the money. You know what I was afraid of? Fellas, I don't think I'm alone. I was afraid of whether or not I was going to be a daddy. I didn't know whether I could love it like a daddy. I walked out in the yard and I looked up and I said, God, I don't want a baby. I said, I just can't hold. I can't. Well, it wasn't long, fellas. You know what I'm talking about. Why can't babies be born in the daytime? It's always about 2 o'clock in the morning, you know. She woke me up. She said, my back's hurting. I said, that's the wrong side, woman. She said, you turn that light off and I'll break your neck. Why, we got up and, you know, you have the little bag packed at 3 months. Everything's ready. Why, put her in a car and we carried her to a little old country hospital. Hey, folks, I was scared to death. 23 years old, $49 a week. All of a sudden, a little girl came through the swinging doors. She had a green sheet. She walked up to me and she said, Mr. Collins, you got a little boy. I said, I don't want him, lady. She said, look at him. I said, I don't want him. She backed me up in the corner. I couldn't go any further. She took the corner of that little old green sheet. She pulled it back. And lady, just one look was all it took. I knew I was old enough to be a daddy. He wasn't that long. I remember, fellas, his little fingers wasn't as long as my fingernail. Just a little fella. He couldn't fight for himself, but it didn't matter because he was mine. And I knew his battles was all right if they were on my shoulders. I don't have to tell you, fellas. They took him down, put him in that little room, and it was 4 or 5 babies in there, but he knew me. He was waving at his daddy, see. We brought him home. We brought him home, and we had him so sweet. We'd put him in the little bassinet. We didn't want to put him in his room. We'd put him right beside us. We'd look down in there in the middle of the night and see if he's still breathing. Just look at him. Before I knew it, he was grown. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the greatest heartache that you will ever know, that I'll ever know, is when something happens to your children. You want to kill this old state trooper? You don't have to shoot me. You just hurt my boy. You want to put me in another world? You don't have to ship me off. Just let something happen to Jeff Collins. You see, ladies and gentlemen, he's all I got. I mean, he's what I live for every day. He's what me and his mamas put money back to send him to school on. You see, ladies and gentlemen, in the 19 years that I've been a state trooper, I've walked up and knocked on 168 doors, and I've told them that their world was fixing to change. I've listened to enough of you ladies scream in this ear till I want to run away. We lost 101 high school students in my state last year. 101. We lost 13 during graduation time when they were doing what? Partying. And you know the great tragedy of the thing, folks, a lot of moms and dads, listen at me. I'm not fussing at you. I'm just going to tell you what an old state trooper wants to tell you. We tell them not to do this, not to do this, but sometimes our actions speak louder than our words. I was sitting in my office one afternoon and the phone rang, and a beautiful lady on the other end said, "Mr. Collins." As soon as I heard her voice, my mind flashed back to graduation night when their only daughter lost her life. She said, "Mr. Collins, could you come by and visit with us?" I said, "Ma'am, let me look, see what my calendar shows for that day." And I looked and I said, "Ma'am, I'm awful sorry. I've got a program in Detroit, and I don't get in to the airport till almost 7:30 on that Delta flight that comes out of Cincinnati." And I said, "It'll just be too late." She said, "It won't matter how late. It'd mean a lot to Floyd and I." And I said, "Yes, ma'am." I landed at our airport and got in the car and started north. I pulled up in the front yard, and folks, they left the porch light on for me, and I knocked on the door. A very polite, lovely lady. She opened the door and said, "Why, hello, Lieutenant, won't you come in?" They had coffee and cake fixed for me. The man was very nice. He spoke, but he didn't carry on a conversation. We sat there for a moment, and finally she reached over and she took a picture off of the cabinet, and she said, "Pam would have been 18 today, Mr. Collins." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Mr. Collins, do you know what happened that night?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." As if she was talking in a different world. She said, "Yes, you were there, were you not?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "I really don't think you understand what happened that night." She said, "We were sitting here on the couch when the phone rang. We were so exhausted, it was Pam's graduation. We watched her walk across the stage, and she took her diploma, and we were so excited. We loved her, and she kissed us and went out for an all-night party." She said, "We were sitting here talking about how fast that time had gone by, and how it was just yesterday that she'd started into first grade. The phone rang and I jumped as I answered it, and it was our local police department saying, you need to come down, that Pam's been involved in an accident. She said, Mr. Collins, we jumped in that little green station wagon right over there. She said, when we pulled up at the hospital, her classmates and friends and neighbors, why, the parking lot was full. We ran down through the corridors between young people and adults, and we ended up in the emergency room, and there a little state trooper stood. He had a bottle of Jack Daniels. And my husband said, what happened? He said, Mr. Bell, your daughter was drinking and driving. He said, that's a lie. My daughter doesn't drink, and she's not old enough to buy alcohol. He said, well, sir, here's the alcohol, and here's the blood test. About that time, the doctor came through the swinging doors and walked over to him and said, Mr. Bell, I'm awful sorry. I tried everything I could. Pam's dead. She said, Mr. Collins, he screamed, and I remember I was watching it. She said, Mr. Collins, he screamed and held me, and finally he pulled away, and he doubled up his fist, and he said, fellas, you put out the word, when I find a man that sold my baby girl a bottle of whiskey, I'll kill him with my bare hands. She said, honey, you don't mean that. He said, yes, I do. She said, Mr. Collins, we came home. Our neighbors came, they brought food, our pastor came, prayed with us, talked with us. Finally, one by one, they started to leave. She said it was almost 3 o'clock, and my husband was walking the floor crying. Said he couldn't sleep. He finally walked in the kitchen and to get him a drink, and he opened the cabinet and he found a note pen, said, Dear Dad, I'm a woman tonight. I hope you don't mind if I borrow a bottle of your whiskey to celebrate. I love you, Pam. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the greatest heartache that I'll ever know is for me to look back and know that this old freckle-faced trooper did something in his life in a way of learning experience for Jeff Collins that he might do wrong. You see, it takes very little talent to make a little baby. But boy, does it take a lot of responsibility to be called a daddy and a mama. One afternoon, I was called to a wreck out on Youth Center Road. When I slid up, the car was lying on its side, driver's side down. I remember that antifreeze had started trickling down the roadway. A man was seated on the ground. He had his hand on his chin, just like this, cursing. I ran up to see about him, and when I did, I looked down at the bottom of a hill in water just about 6, 8 inches deep was a little boy. I remember he had on a pair of blue jeans and green tennis shoes. He was wiggling, trying to hold his head up out of the water to breathe, and his daddy was watching him. I remember as I slid down the wet grass, as I just almost like a sliding board. I fell on my knees in the water, and I reached down and picked him up, and folks, he'd already pulled mud and grass down into his little mouth, and he couldn't breathe. He'd stopped up his air passage, and his little old fist, why, was going just like that. And every time he'd try to breathe, he would, and I took these 2 fingers, and I tried to push down in his mouth. And I tried to pull the mud and the blood and the grass out so he could breathe. And then I put my lips against his so I could try to breathe my life back into his body. And all of a sudden, gang, just like you had taken a switch, turned the lights out. His little fist came together just like that. And he started trembling all over. And then he didn't move anymore. The ambulance broke the silence as it slid up at the top of the hill. I reached down and I picked him up. Hey, ladies, he was about that long. Little fella. I started trying to climb up that old muddy bank, and every root, every tree limb, everything I'd would pull out of the soft mud. And I'd slide back down. I remember he had a little old pair of blue jeans that the knees were torn out. A little T-shirt had Roy Rogers. Just a little fella. Not the first big football player on television that walks up and says, "Give me a light." Was standing there saying, "Here, trooper, give me your hand. I'll help you." Finally, the ambulance personnel threw a rope down and they pulled me up. They put him on this little cot. And the ambulance flew away, their lights flashing, sirens blaring. I turned around and, hey, fellas, his dad's still on the ground, hadn't moved. I walked over and I picked him up and I said, "What do you mean out here with your baby in this truck?" He hit me, and down in that same mud hole where his little old boy just died, I fought for my life. I finally got the cuffs on him, and I picked him up and carried him to the hospital where they'd carried his son. And fellas, I walked into an emergency room with mud and blood all over me when a little old girl ran up to me that I'd watched grow up ever since she was in the community, just like that. She ran up to me and she said, "Mr. Collins, where's Derek?" I said, "Judy, baby, he's dead." "Oh, he can't be dead, Mr. Collins. We just ate supper an hour ago." For an 85-cent beer can, life changes. Folks, listen to me. The man that sat on the hillside and watched his son die filed suit against me for not giving his son proper medical attention. Hey, gang, have we all gone crazy? Phil worked at the ice cream parlor in town. He was coming home on a 4-lane highway. We're fixing to come up to the intersection where it happened. He was coming home after he got off from work in his daddy's new Chevrolet pickup. I was coming around 220 when the call came in on the radio asking for any highway patrol unit in the area. I'd been working all day and I was sleepy and I wanted to go home. I thought to myself, well, I'll let some of these young troopers handle this. The dispatcher keyed the mic again, and I could tell by the sound of her voice it was serious. I finally reached down and I answered, and she said, 1020, Lieutenant. I told her where I was. She said, could you head up on Highway 49? Said they got a pretty bad wreck up there. Someone was on the wrong side of the interstate. They've hit a car head on. I started up the highway, fellas, and started just up a long grade, and she keyed the mic and said, helicopter life stars en route. Well, about that time, those big old rotors started sounding in my ear, and right across the top of my patrol car, the EMS personnel with their big spotlights looking down the highway. I topped the hill, and I could see that big old helicopter starting to settle. As I slid up, I could see a 98 Oldsmobile. The driver was through the windshield. But over here was a Chevrolet pickup. The steam, sir, was still coming out of the radiator. I ran over to the pickup, and those big old chopper blades was kicking sand and dust as they hit me in the face, and I tried to open the driver door, and it was jammed. I looked in. There was a young boy. He was leaning across the front seat, had his arm across his forehead. I ran around to the passenger side, and I opened the door, and I crawled in, and just as I removed his hand from his face, I knew he was dead. His face was just gone. Young people's seatbelt would have saved his life. You say, they don't work all the time? No, but I've never unbuckled a dead person. In 19 years, I've never unbuckled a dead person. Seatbelt would have saved his life, gang. The paramedic tapped me on the shoulder and said, Trooper, let me check him. I slid back out, and he climbed in the cab of this pickup with his white coat on. He stuck his stethoscope underneath his shirt and looked back at me and shook his head. They pulled the cot up, and I reached and grabbed him by his blue jeans and slid him back across the seat. Just as I placed him on those white sheets, they started turning red-stained crimson. I pushed him to his side, and I reached in his left hip pocket. And I pulled out a navy blue canvas billfold. Had Velcro on it. I can hear, even as I speak, that Velcro pulling apart as I opened it, trying to find out who he was. Well, there he was with his senior picture. Had his bow tie on. Had his hair pushed back. Same age as my boy. I looked the next page to try to find his driver's license, and I looked down, and there he was with his mama and his dad and a family portrait and his little sister in the middle. Down in the corner it had Olin Mills. But before I could turn the next page, a little boy tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, "Trooper," he said, "I know who that is." I said, "Are you sure?" "Oh, yes, sir. He plays on our football team. He's our split end." Said, "He works up at Baskin Robbins." Said, "He fixed me a banana split about 9:30. I said, "Son, are you sure?" "Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir." I said, "Do you know where he lives?" "Yes, sir. Why?" "I got to go tell his mom and daddy." "Oh, yes, sir, I'll show you." I got in my patrol car and I started up the roadway, and this little boy was talking 90 to nothing. Then he started to realize, I guess, how serious it was, and he stopped talking and just started pointing. Finally, he said, "There it is, Mr. Collins, that second house right there." Picture with me in your mind, if you can, how my headlights illuminated the front of their home as I turned off of the highway. Ladies, his mother had the curtains tied back on each side, a big picture window. I could see his dad in a recliner. He was reading a newspaper. When he saw my headlights, I watched him as he sat up and he put the paper in his left hand. I watched him as he almost seemed in slow motion. He walked toward that picture window, and he took his right hand and he shielded the light as he looked out the window. And he saw that highway patrol car. I opened the door with my hat in my hand. I'm thinking, God, I don't know what I'd do if somebody's fixing to tell me Jeff Collins wasn't coming back. As a sidewalk right in front of that picture window, I started down, and our eyes met about here. He didn't take his eyes off me, and I didn't take mine off of his. I just walked, and I looked at him. He looked at me. I walked to that big old oak door, and I doubled up my fist to hit it, and before I could ever strike the door, he opened it, and we just stood there and looked at each other. I'd look at him, and he'd try to say something, and I'd try to say something, and we'd both try to talk at the same time, and I was trembling, and he said, "Is it my boy?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Trooper, I don't know what I'm going to do. That boy's running me crazy." Said, "Look what time it is." Said, "He got off at 10 o'clock, and I told him if he was going to be late to call me. He's got my new pickup, and it's costing me everything I can rake and scrape to pay the insurance on it to let him drive." His mother's worried to death about him. Said, is he in trouble? Said, me and him had a fuss this afternoon. I guess he's mad at me. Said his hair's too long, and I told him to get him a haircut or hunt him somewhere else to live. Why, ladies, I don't have to tell you, mamas can just see through brick walls. Why, she came around the corner when she heard us talking. She had on a light blue house coat. I can see her as she draped it across her breast, and she looked at me, and he looked back at her and said, Mama. But when he saw the expression on his wife's face, fellas, do I have to tell you? The greatest heartache you'll ever know. He looked back at me and he put his hand up like a traffic policeman. He said, wait a minute, trooper. He said, me and my boy had a fuss this afternoon. Don't tell me he's hurt. "168 times I've had to say, I'm awful sorry. But your son has been killed in an automobile accident just a few moments ago." Ladies and gentlemen, I watched him as he slid to the floor. He reached out and he grabbed his wife by the leg as she screamed, and he said, Mama, if God will let him come back, he wear his hair any way he wants to wear. You see, folks, we don't ever miss our water till the well goes dry. We just sometimes, we fuss at them because they keep the radio too loud. We fuss at them because they don't pick up their dirty clothes. We fuss at them because they don't keep their room clean. But listen, every day I walk in and hear his radio on, I'm so happy. Every time I kick his dirty underwear out of his doorway, I'm so happy because he's mine. And when I think that he's running me crazy, when I think that there's 1,000 things I'd rather be doing than to listen to him tell me about his girlfriend's problems, I think about all those doors I've knocked on. And I think about all the mom and dads that don't have theirs anymore, that they would give anything in this world if they had just come and sit down on mom and daddy's knee and say, Mama, let me tell you about my boyfriend. Or Dad, let me borrow $10. Hey, folks, do I have to tell you the greatest heartache you'll ever know? It's when your children get hurt. I've stood in court and I've testified. I've stood in hospital rooms and I've taken information. I've sat in living rooms and I've watched you cry. But for a personal moment, let me share with you what you can't see. Do you know what it's like to pull up at home and you walk out in the yard and you say, you know, maybe if I'd have stayed out 20 more minutes. Maybe if I'd have gone south instead of north. Maybe if I'd have taken my lunch break at 11 and stood at 1, maybe I wouldn't have to go to a funeral tomorrow. Do you know what it's like to feel so utterly useless? I drove up to a wreck. A little boy was in the arms of a lady. She had on a sky blue dress, and now it's turning red stain. And I jumped out of my patrol car, and she looked up at me, and she said, Trooper, do something. Do something. That's what this program's all about. I just want to do something.